Good afternoon, everyone. Happy Valentine's Day to all of you from Clemson and from Solutions to the Dropout Crisis. This is Marty Duckenfield with the National Dropout Prevention Center, and I'm here today with a very special co-host and colleague, Dr. Kathy Headley. Kathy's the Associate Dean for Research and Graduate Studies in Clemson University's College of Health, Education, and Human Development. And Kathy's also Professor of Reading Education and was formerly an elementary classroom teacher. It's really good to have you with us today, Kathy.
Marty, it's great to be here. I'm delighted to be with this conversation and look forward to our discussion.
We welcome all of you, as always, to this monthly radio webcast, which is brought to you by the National Dropout Prevention Center at Clemson University in partnership with Clemson Radio Productions and the generous support of Penn Foster and Catapult Learning. Now, we'd love to have those of you who have participated before back again, but we always have new listeners, so welcome to you. We're glad to have you with us. An outstanding program is planned for today, so I'm ready to get started, and I know my friends and guests here are as well. But first of all, I have to remind our listeners and introduce our new listeners to what's on the website so you can participate fully. We have materials on there which are pretty necessary. First of all, you'll see at the top the slide presentation. And this is, in fact, it's a PowerPoint in PDF format, and you'll need to have that open and ready to support today's discussion. Also on the website is a very informative video regarding the Reggio Emilia process. So have a look at that after the program today if you haven't had a chance to see it until now. There's a link to two of our guest publications, which Dee did with us here at the National Dropout Prevention Center. One is on early literacy education, and the second is family literacy strategies. And finally, there's some very good websites. Of course, the National Association for the Education of Young Children and the North American Reggio Emilia Alliance. So, Kathy, we've got some good information here for our listeners to turn to at the close of the program.
You're right, Marty. I know these webcasts are just the first steps in learning about the topic, so I do encourage our listeners to check out these as a follow-up, and to have follow-up resources is certainly a key to good professional development.
Yes, indeed. Now, as always, we invite you to be an active part of the program today. So we've got two ways you can connect to us. This is a radio call-in show, so we encourage you to call in your questions. Our toll-free number is 888-539-8859, and if you're calling from outside the U.S., the number is 864-656-4549. You can call now or anytime during the program. We'll have to put you on hold for a few minutes, but we're going to try to get to as many of our callers as we can. Now, I want to point something out very special because we do like to encourage the conversation, and so callers are great for that. All of our callers today will receive both of these publications that are listed on the website. So when you call, give your name, your phone number, and your email address to Eric, so we can get in touch with you after the program and get these mailed to you. And all of our callers also, this is big, have the chance to have their names put in a hat for a drawing at the end of the season to get a free conference registration to the 2012 National Dropout Prevention Network Conference, which this year will be in Orlando in October. And so the precedent was set for that. In 2011, we had a young man come to the conference who would not have had that opportunity. So I invite you to call and have a chance at winning this.
Marty, remember, too, now we're also accepting email questions sent to our email address, ndpc@clemson.edu, with the word solutions in the subject line. We will try to get to as many of these questions as well.
Yes, and I will just point out that I've got my eye on this computer, and I'm not going to miss those email questions, so do write them in.
I'd like to take a moment to just give a brief introduction to our special speaker, Dr. Dee Stegelin, who's a member of our own faculty here at Clemson's Eugene T. Moore School of Education. As you may have noted, Dee's a professor of early childhood education and has extensive experience with her collaborative research work in Italy with Reggio Emilia. I know Dee has taken many students there to have teaching experiences, and I personally look forward to this discussion today. And remember, Dee is deeply engaged in research and study abroad experience in Reggio Emilia, Italy, so she has first-hand knowledge about this approach. In particular, Dee brings her expertise in applications for math and science education. Welcome to Solutions, Dee, and I'm terribly pleased to be your co-host today.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me to be part of this webcast. I'm really excited about early childhood education as being a really important first step toward dropout prevention. And as you all may know, early childhood education is one of the 15 strategies that are advocated by the National Dropout Prevention Center. And in my experience over the years, I've come to believe that we can learn a lot about international models that inform us about the field of early childhood, particularly in Europe, France, and Italy. And so our presentation today really focuses on a pretty well-known approach that was founded in Reggio Emilia, Italy. So I'm really pleased to be here.
Well, I think today's program looks really special because of its international flavor and how we can learn from others. So Kathy and I are really eager to get started, so I will just remind our listeners one more time about how they can participate. Call us with your questions, and that number again is toll-free, 888-539-8859, and of course if you're calling from the outside the U.S., 864-656-4549. So Dee, why don't we turn to that PowerPoint now and learn more about this new perspective that you'll be sharing with us today.
Okay, for those of you who are listening, if you will go to your PowerPoint slides, the first page is just simply an introduction of the applications of the Reggio Emilia approach to U.S. early childhood settings. And I do want to say that in deference to the Italians, that we give them credit. This is their approach. It is a culturally based approach, and that in the United States we can be inspired by this approach, but it's probably not feasible to completely replicate it, but we can certainly be inspired by their practices. Some of the key concepts of the Reggio Emilia approach are on the next slide, if you'll turn to the next one. And these are concepts that I've really come to appreciate in this approach, in that they view the young child as a very capable learner with great potential for thought and creativity. And I think that this is a fundamental concept from this approach that makes a huge difference in the outcomes that we see with their children. The children are sort of given the benefit of the doubt. They don't have some of the restraints that we sometimes put on young children in the U.S. But in fact, the child is seen as a very intelligent, creative, and thoughtful individual, even as a toddler. A second concept that I think is also very important is the belief that children express themselves through 100 languages. In fact, there's a wonderful textbook. It's a major book in the United States called The 100 Languages of Children. There are 2 editions to it. The last one, I believe, was in 2003. That does a very nice job of explaining their concept that children should be given multiple ways to express their intelligence, their questions, their ideas, their thoughts. And so within this approach, children are encouraged to dance and sing and move to music and to paint and to draw and to whatever it takes for them to be able to express themselves is what is encouraged. A third concept that's also very fundamental is that the relationships within the Reggio Emilia schools are critical to creating a positive environment. And I really think that American schools can learn from this particular concept. They have a more collateral concept. Instead of having like a lead teacher and an assistant teacher, they have co-teaching. And everyone is valued. The cooks sometimes come into the classrooms and assist. Parents are highly involved in the classrooms. So it's a very equal or egalitarian environment that's created, and I think that's conducive to the children expressing their ideas and thoughts. If you'll turn to the next page, the other 3 concepts related to the approach. And another one that I have been very inspired by is that teachers, parents, and children work together collaboratively and as co-investigators. And I think perhaps in American schools we tend to invite parents into our classrooms for special events, conferences, PTA meetings, and that kind of thing, which is wonderful. But I think in Italy it's a culturally based belief that parents are, in fact, the first teachers for their children, and that they should be highly involved in their classrooms also. So parents are engaged in classroom activities at a much deeper and more fundamental level, and because teachers stay with the same group of children for several years, very deep relationships develop between the teachers and the parents. And if parents, for example, are having some difficulty maybe at home, the teacher is often the first one to be confided in because they have the child's interest in mind, and also because the parents really view the teacher as a good friend, as someone that they can trust and really support their needs. Another major concept, an important concept, is that the arts are integrated throughout the curriculum. And it's very inspiring to go into these schools and see all the different forms of documentation of the children's work. The children do a lot of art-related work, but they also use digital photography. The teachers do to capture the learning process. And so photos of the children engaged in their learning activities are posted throughout the room, as well as narratives that go with that, so that the children are free to express themselves, I think, in perhaps a less inhibited way than perhaps we do in the United States. And finally, documentation is elaborate and is an important part of the approach. In-depth portfolios are developed for each child. In the infant-toddler schools, the children are there from about 6 weeks to up to 3 years of age with the same teachers. And then in the second level of school, which is the kindergartens, these are 3 to 6-year-olds. And during the process of the time being in their schools, the teachers work hard to document the growth and the development of each child through digital photography, work samples, and so documentation is a very important part of the curriculum. And I actually apply many of these concepts in my own role as a teacher educator at Clemson, and I encourage all of our students who are going to be teachers to get digital cameras and to start now to develop documentation approaches that will validate children as they see examples of their own work. We're going to turn now to a little bit about the history of the Reggio Emilia schools of northern Italy, and I personally believe that their origins have a lot to do with their success. For those of you who are sort of interested in history, you'll be interested to know that these schools emerged right after World War II, and in that part of Italy there was a great deal of devastation from the war, and in fact Italians today, particularly those who are middle-aged or a little older, really have a lot of respect and camaraderie toward Americans because they remember the role that the U.S. played in the war. But the devastation was so significant in the Reggio Emilia area, and Reggio Emilia is a city in northern Italy of about 170,000 people, and it's located between Milan and Florence. But within the devastation of the post-war era, a man named Dolores Malaguzzi gathered with parents, and they decided to establish these schools. And they actually used some of the byproducts of the war, to earn money to start the schools. For example, they had old tanks and horses and trucks that they sold off and gathered money. And it was a very existential beginning because so many families had lost so much in the war that they had to have some reason to move forward. And so the schools were sort of born out of the ashes of World War II. Dr. Malaguzzi conceived the new school for infants, toddlers, and preschoolers, was active in building the schools, and there is now a Dolores Malaguzzi Center in Reggio Emilia, which is the archives for the Reggio approach. and Dr. Malaguzzi no longer lives, but he has quite a following, but we certainly give him credit for beginning these schools and providing the leadership. The schools, I think, gave hope to the families after the war, and today when you go into the schools, you still feel the passion of those roots of the schools and the way they began. If you'll move to the next slide, there's a picture of one of the preschools in Reggio Emilia, and it's interesting to note that Malaguzzi was an educator and a philosopher, but he was very open to the theorists that influenced him. And so the Reggio Emilia approach is a constructivist approach, and it's based on the theories of Dewey, Piaget, Vygotsky, Gardner, and others. And in fact, Jerome Bruner and Howard Gardner from the United States have all been to these schools, and they, like the rest of us, I think, who go to the schools, are sort of in awe of how Malaguzzi was able to develop this approach that was fed or informed by so many significant theorists, and he was so open to listening to theorists from other countries. And it is a constructivist approach in which children are empowered and they're encouraged to explore their world and to create meanings. And I know when I go particularly into the infant toddler schools, I'm sort of taken aback at how much freedom 2- and 3-year-olds are given to explore materials. In the U.S., I think we're probably a little more restrictive about what we allow 2- and 3-year-olds to do. But from the beginning, the children are taught in these schools to have respect for materials. And so it's not uncommon to see 2-year-olds looking through a magnifying glass at a twig or playing with small rocks and things that we probably would prohibit from very young children. The schools are also very closely integrated into the community and supported financially by the city. In fact, there's a part of the municipal budget is devoted to these schools. Some descriptors of the program that might be of interest to our listeners are that there are 2 levels of centers. The infant toddler centers are for children from infancy through age 3. And then the preschools are for children from age 3 to 6, and they are also known as kindergartens. So there are 2 levels of schools. So the Reggio Emilia approach is officially dedicated to children 5 to 6 and below. Education and care are considered to be an important and essential part of the Italian culture, and so it is assumed that the government, whether it's the municipality, the state funding, that they should be able to provide high-quality, full-day programs for young children. And so the majority of young children in Italy do participate in these early childhood programs that are funded through the state or, in the case of the Reggio Emilia official schools, through the municipality. They have extended day care for children until about 6 o'clock for parents who need it. They have a sliding scale fee for that. But it's, I think, a very significant political decision in Italy that young children are viewed as an investment and something that is essential as part of their budgets. Children from all income levels are included within these schools, with an emphasis on children with special needs and disabilities. In Italy, there is a federal or a national law that is very open and encourages full inclusion of children with special needs. So within every classroom, you will usually find at least one, and sometimes more, children who have a range of special needs and disabilities. And I particularly am very impressed with the social and affective strategies that are embraced in teaching these children. I think perhaps in the U.S. we place a great emphasis on the academic needs of children with disabilities and special needs, but I think in the schools that I've seen in Italy that they work very hard on social inclusion. They also combine social services with education, and so the community is very involved in the schools. And children with disabilities and special needs are served by community agencies. Parents are also involved. And so it's a very collateral, inclusive, and collaborative process. And in Reggio Emilia, about 95% of preschool-age children are enrolled in preschools. And I think we can take a little break right now and see if we have any questions or...
Well, I have one comment, and I know Kathy's got some questions, but I was circling like crazy the key concepts that you had listed about the Reggio Emilia approach. And I'm thinking, this is what we've been advocating, National Dropout Prevention Center and school reformers, for all students. And I think the value that the capable learner of a 3-year-old is such dignity provided for children, that all children, yours college students you're talking about with the portfolios, these are good principles for all students. And this is, to me, fascinating how this plays out with the little ones who, like you say, we don't often think they're able to do that. But that first one, the child is capable, says so much.
Yes, it's one of the principles that I think that I'm most inspired by, that I wish we could translate a little bit more into our own settings.
Yeah, we're so protective, I think, in some ways. So, Kathy, did you have some questions? And before I'll just remind our listeners, if you want to call in, it's 888-539-8859. Kathy.
Well, I found these first slides really informative and interesting, and some of them I'd like a little more information and some examples. For example, on slide 2, you talked about the languages of children, and I hope that you would talk a bit more about how children express themselves and how this impacts learning in the classroom, at home, and at play.
Okay, well, that's a really good question. I visit the official Reggio preschools, and I also visit some of the primary schools in Reggio Emilia. And I do think that this is a principle that I see throughout Italian schools. But, for example, in an infant-toddler center, I have seen infants who can sit up, we'll say 12 to 15 months of age. They're placed on a large piece of paper, and they're a little smock is put around their necks. And then they are free to paint, and they're given paint. And if they want to paint their hands and their arms and their neck, they're allowed to do that. And in fact, last year, when I was in one of the Reggio preschools, and this was an older child. Actually, I think she was more like maybe 3.5. She was very interested in the color green. And so she was exploring the color green in multiple ways. She had been drawing with crayons, and she moved to paint. And they allowed her to take off her shirt and her pants and to paint. And so she pretty much was covered with green paint after about 20 minutes. And then they took her, and then she had a little bath, and they took some pictures, but she was allowed to explore. I think another example is that they encourage what I call indoor-outdoor play. So, for example, on the buildings, you'll find art easels and paint set up right outside of the windows of the building. And so children can go outside to paint. And they use the outdoors as like another learning environment. They'll set up little picnic tables, and the children can gather there. They cook together. And I consider this all forms of expression because they tend to, whatever materials they explore, they weave concepts into, whether it's color or shape or number concepts. So there's a lot of learning going on within this fluid process. So painting, dancing, they have ateliers, which are open areas in the schools that serve as a place for parent meetings and also to hang up coats and that kind of thing. But in the ateliers, they will have dress-up areas for the children to dress up as men or women. And they'll have purses and coats, and they can dance to music. They have a lot of different musical avenues that they use. And then I think that they use light in a very creative way. For example, they might have an opaque projector set up in one corner of the room, and they will place common materials on the opaque projectors, and then the children see those very typical items, but in a completely different way. And so they also use light, overhead projectors, light tables, so that children see things in a three-dimensional way. They encourage the children to paint and reproduce and do three-dimensional things with clay, with Play-Doh, with mud. And those are just some examples.
Well, we have calls. So,
yes, we do.
Marty, help us out here.
We got a couple coming in. And, I mean, all I can say is I think everybody should go to Italy because I think we could all learn that no matter what the age of our students. Carl, welcome to the program again. It's always good to have Carl call in from Alaska.
Oh, wow.
So, welcome to the program. Do you have a comment or a question, Carl, for Dee?
Oh, probably both. Number one, preschool education has been something that's been very dear to my family's heart. For years, my wife is a certified teacher that works with the school district, but as an early childhood educator. And my question, and also she's Italian, so she's been to Italy, and she hopes to go over there to teach sometime, and learn more. But my question is, dropout prevention or dropout situation is worldwide, and I just want to know whether these programs have had any carryover effect. What is the rate of dropout in Italy? That's pretty much my question, and thanks, Marty.
Mm-hmm.
I will take a stab at that question. It has had, I think, a positive influence on curriculum. We call it trickle up, in that the funding for the primary and elementary schools is through the state. So it's a different funding source than these official Reggio preschools, which are through municipal funding. But they are trying to promote some of the same concepts at the primary level. And as I said, the Reggio approach is really culturally based. And so, for example, even in the elementary schools, the children have the same, they try to keep the same teachers with the same group of children for 3 to 5 years. And so I've been there at the end of the school year when there's celebrations, and the teachers are very respected, and I think the parents work hard at promoting the value of education and those relationships. I really can't speak officially to the dropout rate. I don't know what it is. I do think that in this region, and the whole region of northern Italy, that includes Bologna, Parma, Modena, and Reggio Emilia, utilize this particular approach. And I think that their schools are prosperous and that they're faring very well. In fact, the city of Reggio Emilia is growing partly because of immigration. It's seen as a prosperous place because of their good schools and also because of employment. So they are dealing with immigration much like we are, but they have a more constructive approach to it, I think. They sort of fold everyone in, and they really respect people's different religious perspectives. They have families coming from Asia, and they have Muslim families coming in. And I'm really impressed with how they work with those families. Marty might have some information about the dropout rate in Italy. But
well, what I want to say is this looks on fertile ground here
yes.
for some research, and somebody's got to go to Italy.
Yes, that's right.
We're going to have a lot of people who want to go and check that down. But I think, Carl, what you're suggesting is longitudinally what has happened to these children who start life this way, and that would be terrific if, well, I know you are going this spring. Maybe you
Sure.
can kind of explore, do some initial exploring on that, Dee, and we'll see where that goes. But that's an excellent question, and certainly something that we would expect would have a positive impact. And it certainly sounds like the community is flourishing.
Right. And I will say that I have talked with teachers in the elementary schools who get children from the Reggio schools and then the state-funded preschools. And I've asked, do you see a difference? And they'll say that initially the children who come from the Reggio preschools are not quite as compliant. as the children who come from the faith-based or the state-funded. But in the long run, they tend to be more persistent and very solution-oriented. They stay on task, and they're very creative in their thinking, which I think probably serves them well as they go through elementary school.
Oh, sounds fascinating. Thank you, Carl, for calling. We have another caller on the line, Marion. Hey there, from Bennettsville, South Carolina. So glad you are joining in the program today. Can we get me?
Yes.
Oh, there you are. Okay, wasn't sure whether we had you.
Yes.
Yeah, you got a question or comment for Dee?
Yes, I have a question, actually. In working with early childhood children, particularly preschool children, do you have a particular, I'm at a school and announcement's getting ready to come on. I'm sorry.
That's okay. It sounds very natural to me.
I'm so sorry. Okay, but do you have a particular curriculum that you follow or suggest or in this model or standards, checklists or something like that? Just trying to look for something that's helpful as you try to
they do have standards in learning standards in Italy for the preschool population, and they embed the learning within the constructivist approach. So they're informed by standards like we are. I think they are much less restricted by them than we are. They do testing with the older children. However, you don't see so much standardized testing with very young children. I don't know if that helps, but we don't really have a model in the United States or an approach that I would say is comparable.
Okay.
Okay, does that help,
Thank
Marion?
you.
Okay, thanks for calling. And
Sure.
maybe we're going to find out some more specifics now, drill down a little bit into these concepts as we move on now. Thank you, both the callers and Kathy, for our questions. They've really made the discussion good so far, but we need to keep going now.
Okay. In terms of...
No, go right ahead. I'll save my questions. Notice I've been too enthusiastic.
I know.
My questions, so I'm going to give it back to Dee.
I think we want a 3-hour program today.
I think so. I'm very interested.
Okay. Moving on to the slides, if you're following, the growth of the Reggio Emilia approach in the United States. It was first brought to the U.S. in the early 1990s by the National Association for the Education of Young Children and the University of Massachusetts. And that is where I first learned about it. And so it's been in the United States not quite 20 years. And over that course of time, we've seen a rapid growth of the approach throughout the U.S. It is influencing many early childhood programs, but is not seen as a model that can be easily replicated. I would say that the majority of settings in the United States who utilize the Reggio Emilia approach are private or faith-based. For those of you who are in the South Carolina area, we have an example of the Reggio Emilia approach in Greenville, and that is at the First Baptist Kindergarten Center. And it is an official Reggio Emilia site. They have the Italians come and work with them, and our students have the opportunity to go and observe. They have visitor days, but it's a wonderful place, and it is a faith-based site. Some key concepts of the Reggio Emilia originated in the U.S. and are familiar to U.S. educators. And some of the applications that I have seen in U.S. schools that I think are encouraging to me are the view of the child as a learner in Reggio-inspired schools. Notice that I say Reggio-inspired schools in the U.S., because they really cannot be replicated in the United States. Our practices can be informed by them, but I think if you go to Reggio-inspired settings, you will find a different perspective on how teachers view the children as learners. And staff development has also been positively affected. I tell my undergraduate students that, when they get into their real-world jobs, that some of their greatest resources will be their grade-level teachers, their peers. And in Reggio Emilia, staff development is built into the week, so that about a half a day a week is devoted to staff development, in which case the teachers meet together. They discuss each child. They discuss the ebb and flow of the curriculum in the classroom. And they sometimes do this over wine and bread. So it's a little different than our staff development in the U.S. But I think we can learn from them. And again, it's not a hierarchical perspective. It's a collateral perspective. So staff development is critical to this approach because they are so child-oriented and they stay focused on the group process, but they know where every child is emotionally and academically, and that takes time. It takes time to document and then time to discuss that documentation. So what may look like just a free-flowing curriculum is really a very thoughtful curriculum, and the teachers spend a lot of time in their planning during staff development. Cooperation is seen as a foundation of learning, and so that's an application that I've seen in U.S. schools where relationships are a focal point. Parents who are involved in classrooms inspired by the Reggio approach are much more integrated into the actual setting. They do more than bring egg cartons to the teacher or other supplies that she needs. They may be involved in curriculum decisions. They may actually come on a regular basis and maybe help in the reading center or the science center. So parent involvement is increased. I've seen lots in the area of documentation in Reggio-inspired settings in the U.S. where teachers are using digital cameras more. They're documenting children's work on a more ongoing basis, and they're doing more portfolio work. And so I think documentation is an area in the U.S. that has really benefited from being informed by this approach. As technology advances, it increases our chances and opportunities and ways to do documentation. So videotaping, audio taping, digital photography, and recording are all parts. And then with technology changing the way it is, it's hard to imagine what it might be in a few years. Another example of applications in the U.S. Is project work. And we probably know of project work through particularly Dr. Lillian Katz's work here in the United States. But if you look at the history of the project approach, it really began in Europe 400 or 500 years ago in architectural schools in Europe. And so I see project work as being an important part of the Reggio Emilia curriculum and the approach. And by project work, I mean that the interests of the children inform them as to what they're going to focus on. And I'll give you some examples. I've been in some preschools in Italy where perhaps the children took a field trip to a farm and they were so enthralled with the farm that became their project theme for the whole year. And so the project work might last a month, it might last several months, it might last an entire academic year. And through this project theme, they intertwine all the different content areas: language arts, reading, math, science, art, music expression, and creativity. So I think project work is something that American schools actually would benefit using more of. I think we have a lot of seat work, sedentary, restrictive kinds of instructional strategies, and that project work encourages small group collaboration and cooperation among children. They invent ways to express their ideas together, and it also keeps them very interested. So because the curriculum is informed by the children's real passions and their real interests, project work sustains itself very well. And keep in mind that these schools are financed by the municipality, so a significant part of the budget for the municipality goes toward the schools, and so they have more resources for example, making multiple copies of children's work or scanning and reproducing than what we often have. But I do think that project work is something that American teachers would benefit. It would help break up some of the rather teacher-directed, top-down kind of instruction that I see, at least in a lot of elementary schools. And project work can engage children in doing computer-based searches, using KidPix or other forms of software to encourage illustrations to go with their narrative writing. So project work is something I've seen as an outcome in the U.S. Integration of the arts throughout is another application that I have seen in the U.S., where I think art is no longer seen as something separate from math and science and social studies, but as a part of all the curriculum. And for schools who can integrate the arts throughout the curriculum, I think they'll find much more divergent ways of meeting the children's interests and needs.
Are we ready to go forward, or do we have a little chance for Kathy to ask her question?
Yeah. Good, because
she's been chomping at the book.
Yes, I have. I almost leaped in earlier because I do want to hook on to one thing from the last caller before I have my next question. I'm just really impressed with the use of documentation, and especially right now when we're just really overwhelmed with assessment and evaluation, to actually use children's own work to really take a deeper look at learning. And I love the word documentation, so adding that bit of vocabulary to us, I'm impressed by that. I'm also impressed with the level of trust that I hear throughout. And a question really has to do with application. How can teachers, parents, and children begin to work more closely and collaboratively if this process is just a beginning point for them?
Right. I think that that's a really good question, and I think that that teachers, and I really encourage this in our undergraduate students to, as they start their new jobs, to really seriously consider the relationships that they have with the parents of the teachers, or the parents of the children in their classroom. And even though I think as a new teacher, which can be very overwhelming, you might want to push parents aside, and think I've got to work on lesson plans and classroom management, etc. But I really encourage them to really seriously consider how they construct those relationships. And I do think that trust is at the heart of it. I think that if they can build trusting relationships with the parents, that will follow with the children. And I'm not saying that, if you do that, you won't have any problems, any challenges with parents. But in fact, it gives you more tools to work with problems. And so a teacher who's really worked hard at building trust and respect, a respectful relationship with each parent, is going to set a foundation for problem solving with issues that might arise during the school year, and also it's going to expand and enrich his or her role as a teacher, because she and he, they'll get ideas from parents that they never would have thought of on their own. And parents know their children best in terms of their interests, their passions, things that they're afraid of. They just know their children. And so if teachers will take that first step to foster the relationships with the parents, a lot of this will fall into place in terms of parents feeling comfortable then to come into the classroom. They build a respect for the teacher when they see all the work, the hard work that the teacher does in meeting the needs of the children. And it kind of builds on itself. But I really do think it begins a lot with the teacher and their perspective with the parents.
That's really good relationship advice as well. So, Dee, I'm going to hold my next one and let you go on with the content, because you've got a lot of good content still to share with us.
Okay. Let's see.
I think we're up to a view of the child as a learner is what I have coming up next.
Right. Viewing the child as highly competent, and I think in the U.S. we've had a tendency maybe to be a little bit more of a deficit model. And it's been well intended, but we like to assess children and then sort of place them into boxes. And I think that the Italians do a really good job of assessment, but they don't categorize so much. There is the assumption that every child has a tremendous amount of ability. And if a child has a disability, then that's just a nuance. You just have to work with that to be successful. And so I think that it really starts with all of us viewing children as being very, very intelligent, very positive, having tremendous capacity. And I do see that as a real application in the U.S., as something that we all can benefit from. And also that children need individualized pacing of learning. And I'm sort of in awe of some of the schools I go into when I see teachers with fairly complex primary classrooms doing individualized instruction, being sensitive to how some children need more time, others need less, different forms of stimulation work. So I think we are informed by that. And an appreciation of the unique interests and skills of each child. I think that, again, this is culturally based, and my experience in Italy is that the family is just such an important unit in their culture, in their society, and it's founded also on their Catholic religion, in which children are very much valued and treasured, and that the individualism of each child, I think, is rooted at a very deep level. In terms of staff development, I think that we can benefit from having a more egalitarian perspective of roles and relationships among teachers. It's very easy to fall into hierarchical roles in which power is more power-based, and I really don't see that in the Italian schools. I think that, for example, assistant teachers in some of our classrooms are given a tremendous amount of responsibility, and while there needs to be some delineation of responsibilities based on education level, there's a respect for each individual within the school system, in the Reggio schools, that I think goes a long way in modeling for children the importance of respect and for establishing relationships. In terms of project work, learning is best when it's reflective and in-depth, and project work allows children to explore a topic in a cyclic way. They can revisit, which I really am a firm believer in. I think sometimes we stratify a lot in the U.S. We cover things pretty quickly, and then we move on to the next topic and then the next one. And I see more in-depth exploration in project work where children actually explore a concept in multiple ways. And it also engages children in small and individual group work, which they also build trust that way because they decide to do a task together, or they sometimes assign roles among themselves, and that takes patience and respect and trust. Project work is also displayed and used for assessment purposes. I wish that I could show you some of my documentation panels that I have from Italy. I use them in my classes, and the students are just amazed. I share one that children, I think they were 3, and a number of the children had new baby brothers and sisters, and so the questions began to come about babies and where they came from, and so the teacher did a month-long project on babies, and then she had a culminating art experience, and she asked the children to draw a picture about what they thought about babies. And so I have actually examples of what the children drew, and then written under them in Italian and in English are verbatim what the child says about what their drawing was. And these are displayed, and they are used for assessment purposes, because the teachers then can see not only what this child understands that's accurate or not accurate about babies, but also about relationships. And I remember one that a little girl drew, and she has a great big head, a huge smile, big eyes, and a little curl on the top of her head. And she said, "When I was born, I was beautiful." And you can just tell that this child has a positive self-esteem. So you can tell a lot about their drawings, and also about their vocabulary and their conceptualization of ideas. But I think project work has enriched our classrooms. And then documentation, which we've talked about some, is actually used to capture the learning process. And again, in U.S. schools, we tend to be a little bit more product or outcome oriented. And in these schools, the emphasis is on the learning process. So they will take, for example, a sequence of digital photographs of a child, maybe 5 to 10 pictures of the child, as he or she is doing some kind of art project or molding clay, and then they study each photograph. And so they're very interested in how the child learns and how the child expresses themselves. And the end product is interesting, but the process is equally as interesting, and I think we can learn a lot from that. The sequential photos capture the learning process, and children actually love to see themselves, and it's very validating when they can look at themselves in the middle of a learning process and see how they grew from it. And we've been enriched, I think, by those ideas and also by portfolios and panels that are displayed in classrooms. In terms of parent involvement and engagement in the schools, we can view parents as much more than an external resource for materials. They can actually be very effective volunteers in the classroom. They can be decision makers. They can contribute to the curriculum. I think that we should get parents' ideas about whatever reading curriculum we're using or a math curriculum and get the parents' perspective on how the child is reacting to it at home, things that they're saying to the parent, to really view parents almost as co-teachers. And parents can support project work and documentation. Parents like to feel important in the classroom. They like to feel like they have a role. So they can actually help take photographs. They can help with the documentation process. Finally, in terms of integration of the arts, in the Reggio-inspired schools that I have observed here in the U.S., I've seen much more use of music and movement, songs and poetry, drama, creativity in general for children to, for example, express math concepts with paint, which I think is great. And then using the arts, multiple expressions, everything from painting to drawing. And then I think I described the very young child who could sit up and was painting and was very happy to paint on a large piece of paper and a large paintbrush, and no one was concerned that the paint got on his foot or whatever. And if you give a child that kind of pure opportunity, you'll be surprised at how long they want to continue to do it, because the process itself feeds their own engagement. And we need to give children more opportunities like that.
Well, we want to continue the conversation. I know Kathy's got a lot of comments, and I'm going to remind listeners what the telephone number is, and then I have someone who's written with a question, so we'll get to that in a second, too. But there is a toll-free number, in case you tuned in late or didn't write it down. It's 888-539-8859, and you can engage in our conversation with us. Or if you have a question that, just like this next one, requires a short answer, it's ndpc@clemson.edu, where you can write us. And then the other number we have, if you're overseas, maybe there's someone from Italy.
Yes.
Wouldn't that be cool? 864-656-4549. So we have all those opportunities. But Stephanie has written us from South Dakota. And let me read her question. It's about the ratio of, she's wondering what the child-student-to-teacher ratio is in these early childhood classrooms, the Reggio Emilia approach.
Yes, that's actually a really good question. I actually find the ratios to be higher there. They have perhaps 20 to 26 children in a classroom with 2 teachers. However, the rooms are usually quite large, and they'll have multiple centers throughout the classroom. And there's usually at least one other adult in the classroom. It might be a teacher who is particularly assigned to a child with special needs. So there are usually more children within the classrooms, but the classrooms are larger. They provide more center-based kinds of activities, and they have large outdoor areas and then indoor-outdoor areas where right outside of the building there'll be the roof will extend so that tables can be set up under there. So they have a lot of different learning environments that engage the children in small group work. So when you're in there, you don't really notice that there are more. You have to physically stop and count the children because it doesn't feel crowded or overwhelming. And so their ratios are probably more like 1 to 10, 1 adult to 10 children, whereas in the U.S., according to our accreditation guidelines, they would be a little bit less than that. But often our spaces are much limited, much smaller, and we also usually don't have as much outdoor space.
Okay, well, Stephanie, I think you got a good answer there. And Kathy, I know you had some things you wanted to discuss further with Dee.
Well, I happen to know that Dee has worked extensively with child development centers, and I just wondered how you might advise these centers to incorporate more of the approach.
That's a really good question, and I do. I think that there are lots of ways. I do think that if a center is really interested in being informed by this approach, that they need to form a small study group. And so a director, for example, might decide to have some staff development on the Reggio Emilia approach. There are some wonderful articles, books that can be read and shared. And so I think that to get an understanding of the philosophical foundations of it, so that the teachers are really informed about why the teachers do what they do. So I would start with a small study group, and then I probably would take the teachers maybe to a site that is operating using the Reggio Emilia approach, because I do think you have to see it to understand it. It also would make it very concrete in their own minds about ways they might translate into their own classroom. But I would start with a thorough study of it. And then I might identify, and again, I think this needs to be generated by the teachers, that they need to work as a group, maybe one or two strategies that the center is going to embrace as a center. And it might be, we're going to increase our relationships with parents. We're going to start engaging parents at a much deeper level in our center, and they decide on several strategies to do that. Another one might be documentation. We're going to start documenting children's work in our classrooms in these different ways, and we're going to display their work. And I would suggest doing it step by step. I think it is an approach that really deserves study first and then incremental adaptation, so that doing one or two strategies is probably enough for a center to start with, and maybe a long-term goal is to adapt 4 or 5 strategies from the Reggio approach. But that's how I would start.
That's excellent advice, Dee. Marty, do we have another email question?
We have an email. Gosh, you saw my eyes reading with fascination this question from Christine. And I'm going to read it verbatim because there's a lot here. She says, I can't help but think how perfect this approach to early childhood education would be for integrating Roma or Gypsy children, encouraging and validating their self-expression, especially the artistic avenues, developing trust, encouraging parental involvement, individual approach to support learning, whether a diagnosed disability or experiential disadvantage. What's your knowledge or experience with this approach being implemented in areas with Roma populations, and whether it has any influence on keeping these youth in school once they go on to, and she's got quotes, basic school?
Right. I do know that in Reggio Emilia, Italy, because they are having so many, I think 4 out of 10 children now are immigrant children, that they are folding these families in, and at the same time, it's a dance with the family. I mean, the family informs them, and then they make adjustments in their environments and their routines to fit the family. So I am seeing Roma children in those settings that are being accommodated, and I think creating a sense of belonging in the classroom, some stability, it helps them get anchored in the academic setting. And I think it has to do with their focus on relationships, that the schools, the Reggio schools, the relationships come first. So whatever they need to do to get to know those parents, those families, and what their needs are, and they're going to vary from so much from one family to another, that when it starts that way, then the response that the teachers and the schools make to the children are going to meet their needs. So it starts with the real respect for the relationship with the families. Hypothetically, I would think that your question is really a good one. I don't know of examples here in the U.S., but I do see it working in Italy with families coming in with very different religious, cultural backgrounds, language backgrounds, and they're adapting. They're all working together, and it's really marvelous to watch it. I just think we need to learn from them a little more. I think we could learn more from the social emotional relationships that are built there.
Thank you. I would be really interested to see, since we can't all necessarily go to Italy with you, although that sounds like such a great idea, but with nearby to us here at Clemson University, one in Greenville, this question that was earlier from Carl, the transition to what Christine calls basic school from such a incredible environment. What are you seeing in Greenville? Because you're closer to that. Have you seen where they're feeding these children into a different school, the typical school setting, and how are they adapting and accommodating?
I can tell you just a little bit. I mean, I don't know in depth about that. I do think that in Italy and in the U.S. there is a transition for children who come from this sort of creative, free-flowing, child-oriented kind of environment to a more structured primary school. Usually in the United States that would be kindergarten. And I do think that, at least what I'm seeing in Italy, is that they start a transitional process during the last year in the preschool. And the primary schools work with the kindergarten or with the preschools to invite the children who are going to go to the primary school the next year. They come over like 3 or 4 times during the year. They view the classrooms. The primary teachers come to the preschools and share books with them. So they start building relationships during that last year. That helps. Mm-hmm. And I do think there's some effort, at least in Reggio Emilia, to facilitate the transition of children from the Reggio preschools to the public-funded primary schools. In the U.S., I'm not sure. I'm not sure about Greenville. I think that I have heard that some parents actually have their children go to kindergarten the first year at the preschool setting, and then they do a year of kindergarten in the public school.
Ah, I see.
But I don't know that that's widespread. Yeah. But I think the whole issue is transition, that you can do a lot to make that smoother.
Well, I mean, the way we start is so important, and we all know that here, as far as what happens down the road. And there's so many paths. We joke about we should have a 3-hour show because, I mean, the more we talk about, the more questions I have. I don't know, Kathy, if you had any more burning questions you wanted to throw at Dee, because we've got a few more minutes if you have time.
Well, this may be a challenge question. She may want to address it briefly. I think it has a lot of depth to it. But I know that Dee has done a lot of work in policy, and that policy here is extremely important in our nation and particularly in our state. And I wondered what advice you might have of how we might build more support in our state and nation for preschools. Some brief, quick advice for the limited time we have?
Well, I think I am encouraged that the Obama administration is coming forth with early learning initiatives, funding. I think they have $10 billion that they have devoted to early childhood. I think that the last few years have been very difficult with the economy, and it's like it got put on the back burner. But I'm seeing more and more come across my email system of initiatives now, grant money, through the Department of Education at the national level. I also think that Head Start is being supported more in terms of teacher preparation. I think that for many states that have been cash-strapped the last few years, that maintaining quality early childhood programs has been very challenging. So in terms of policy, particularly in a state like South Carolina, which is like many other, I think, states in the South, we have a child population that very much needs early intervention. And so I think it really is a challenge for parents and for professionals to be in constant touch with their decision makers, with their legislators, to let them know that investing in young children first is going to pay off for everybody later on. And I think I'm encouraged because I see economists, James Heckman and others, are writing about the importance of investing in young children. It's an economic investment. I think we've been saying that for a long time, but when economists write it, it has more power. So I just think we need to keep working at it, and group together to get to our decision makers.
Thank you, Dee. Mm-hmm. Well, this has truly been an interesting program, and here we are at the end so soon. We've certainly had a valuable hour learning more about the Reggio Emilia and early childhood education. Thank you both for having me here for this hour. It has been a most pleasant task indeed.
I know it has not been a task at all. It's been a treat. And I'd like to thank you, Dee, for being here with us and certainly have provided, I just want to continue the conversation in so many ways. But I think our listeners, from what we're hearing and the feedback here, are valuing this program so much, and then those who will listen to the later broadcast will hear it as well. This Reggio Emilia has a lot to offer. So it is important to start early in dropout prevention, y'all. So we need to further explore this. So thank you for being with us.
Well, thank you for having me, and I would like to encourage our listeners to visit Reggio-inspired sites in your nearby area. If you go to conferences, go to sessions about them. It is a continual learning process. They call it an approach rather than a model because they see it always as in process, which I really value and respect them for that. There is a North American Reggio Emilia Alliance and NAEYC, so there's a lot of ways to learn more about it.
Oh, yes, and there's so much to learn, and every bit of it's going to be valuable. Thank you. Well, we've come to the end, and we want to remind our listeners that this radio webcast, like all our monthly programs, will be archived on our website, and it'll be downloadable for your iPod or your MP3 player. And it's also available on iTunes. Ladies, did you know that you are now going to be on iTunes?
No, that's great.
Yes, you and Adele. And you can actually subscribe to Solutions and get each month's program so you can go back and listen again. And when you're driving around in the car, and recommend it to your friends and your colleagues. And we do recommend that you use the archive program with the slides for professional development activity for your faculty or your community. In March, our guest will be Michael Van Keulen of the National Youth Leadership Council, and our topic will be, of course, if it's National Youth Leadership Council, it's going to be on service learning. So mark your calendars today for Tuesday, March 13th at 3:30 p.m. Eastern Time. And thanks to all of you for listening and participating. Remember that we know why students are dropping out of school, and with research-based solutions, we can assure that all of our students graduate. So join us next time for more Solutions to the Dropout Crisis.